The soft chime of the cafe's doorbell announced the arrival of John Carter. He was a man of 75, his presence understated yet commanding in a way that only time and experience could bestow. Dressed in a worn navy blue jacket and a pair of well-used jeans, John's appearance was simple but clean. His face, a canvas of deep lines and sun-weathered skin, told stories of a life filled with both triumphs and struggles. His silvery gray hair, neatly combed back, framed piercing blue eyes that carried an unspoken wisdom. The cafe was a sleek, modern establishment in the heart of Manhattan. Its tall windows allowed sunlight to flood the room, bouncing off polished marble tables and designer light fixtures. The air carried the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee, mingled with the soft hum of subdued conversations and the occasional clatter of cups and saucers. John stepped in quietly, clutching a leather wallet in one hand. His gaze swept across the room as he searched for a seat. He chose a small table near the window, where he could watch the bustling city outside. Sitting down with a soft sigh, he checked his watch, a silver timepiece worn from decades of use. His son, Michael, was running late. That wasn't unusual, considering his demanding job as the chief of police in New York City. John leaned back in his chair, letting his thoughts drift. He wasn't one to complain about waiting. Patience was a virtue he'd mastered long ago, first as a young soldier in Vietnam, and later as a father raising a family. The cafe staff moved briskly around him, most not paying him much attention, except for one. Amanda, the cafe manager, stood behind the counter, observing him with a critical eye. She was a woman in her early 40s, dressed in a sharp black blazer that screamed authority. Her hair was tied in a sleek ponytail, and her lips pressed into a thin line as she took in John's modest appearance. To her, he didn't fit the profile of the cafe's usual clientele. Young professionals in tailored suits or tourists indulging in overpriced pastries. As John adjusted his jacket and leaned forward, Amanda whispered something to a barista, her gaze lingering on him. Her expression carried a subtle disdain, the kind born from snap judgments and misplaced arrogance. Unbothered, John pulled out a small notepad from his pocket and began jotting down something, a habit he'd picked up to keep his mind sharp. The stage was quietly set for an encounter that neither of them could yet foresee. Amanda, the cafe's manager, stepped out from behind the counter, her heels clicking sharply against the polished wooden floor. Her sharp eyes were fixed on John Carter, who sat quietly at his table, occasionally glancing at his watch. Something about his modest demeanor and well-worn clothes irritated her. This cafe was a place of refinement, or at least that was how Amanda saw it. To her, John stood out like an old penny in a roll of shiny dimes. She approached his table with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good afternoon, sir," she began, her tone overly measured. "Can I help you with something?" John looked up from his notepad, surprised by her abrupt presence. "Oh, no, thank you," he said, his voice calm but tinged with a hint of weariness. "I'm just waiting for someone." Amanda's eyes scanned the empty coffee cup in front of him, the only thing he'd ordered. "Waiting, I see," she said slowly. "You do know this is a popular cafe, right? We tend to have a certain type of clientele here." John raised an eyebrow, catching the implication. "I wasn't aware there was a dress code," he replied evenly, his tone neither confrontational nor apologetic. "I'm just here to meet my son." Amanda crossed her arms, leaning slightly forward. "We usually cater to professionals and tourists. Are you sure you're in the right place?" John straightened in his seat, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Yes, ma'am, I'm certain. My son picked this spot," he said, his voice steady but firm. "He's running a little late." Amanda's polite mask began to slip, replaced by an air of condescension. "Look, I'm not trying to be rude," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But if you're just here to sit and wait, perhaps you could do that somewhere else? We have paying customers who need seats." John took a deep breath, setting his notepad down. He met Amanda's gaze without flinching. "I am a paying customer," he said, gesturing to the cup in front of him. "And last I checked, a cup of coffee buys me the same rights as anyone else here." The exchange had begun to draw subtle attention. A few nearby customers glanced over, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Amanda, sensing the eyes on her, straightened and adjusted her blazer. "Well," she said sharply, "if you're going to stay, I hope your son doesn't keep you waiting too long." John gave her a small, knowing smile. "He won't," he said simply. "And I appreciate your concern." Amanda hesitated, caught off guard by his unshakable composure. Without another word, she turned and walked back to the counter, her heels clicking a little louder than before. John returned to his seat, his expression calm but thoughtful. The room settled back into its usual rhythm, but a few onlookers continued to watch him, their curiosity piqued. Little did Amanda know, her assumptions and judgments were about to collide with a reality she couldn't have anticipated. As Amanda returned to the counter, her frustration simmered just beneath the surface. Something about the old man's calm defiance unsettled her. She prided herself on maintaining order and exclusivity in her cafe, and John's unassuming presence felt like a disruption she couldn't ignore. From his seat by the window, John continued to wait, occasionally glancing at his watch. He noticed the subtle glances from other customers, but paid them no mind. Years of military service had taught him to ignore distractions, to remain steady under pressure. Still, he couldn't help but wonder why Amanda had singled him out. Amanda, meanwhile, decided to take matters further. She approached John's table again, this time with a more direct approach. Her voice was lower, but the condescension was unmistakable. "Sir," she began, folding her arms tightly, "I really need to ask, are you sure you're supposed to be here? This cafe isn't exactly casual." John looked up from his notepad, his expression a mix of amusement and disappointment. "Ma'am, I've already told you. I'm waiting for my son," he said calmly. "I've also ordered and paid for my coffee. Is there something else I need to do to prove I belong here?" Amanda let out a small, incredulous laugh. "Well, I couldn't help but notice you haven't ordered anything else. Perhaps if you—" John cut her off, his tone still calm but now carrying a sharp edge. "Perhaps if I what? Bought a more expensive coffee? Dressed differently? Ma'am, I don't think the problem is what I've ordered." Amanda's face flushed slightly, but she pressed on. "Look, I just need to make sure we're maintaining the right atmosphere for our customers. You're sitting at a prime table, and if you're just loitering then—" "Loitering?" John interrupted, his voice rising just enough to draw the attention of more patrons. He leaned forward slightly, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "Let me tell you something about loitering. When I was a young man, I spent weeks on end in the jungles of Vietnam, waiting for an enemy attack. That was loitering. Sitting here, sipping coffee, and waiting for my son? That's just being a paying customer." The air in the cafe grew thick with tension. A few customers exchanged uneasy glances, and the quiet hum of conversation stilled. Amanda stood frozen, caught off guard by the quiet intensity of John's words. Before she could respond, a voice from across the cafe cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" A tall man in his late 40s strode toward them, his crisp police uniform unmistakable. His strong jawline and sharp eyes bore a striking resemblance to John's. It was Michael Carter, and from the look on his face, he had already pieced together enough of the situation to know his father had been disrespected. Michael Carter's presence filled the room the moment he walked in. Standing over 6 feet tall, he carried himself with the confidence and authority befitting his role as the chief of police for New York City. His uniform, crisp and impeccably tailored, bore the insignia of his rank, a visible testament to his dedication and years of service. As he approached his father's table, his sharp eyes quickly assessed the situation. The tension between John and Amanda was palpable, and the room had grown unnaturally quiet. Michael's gaze briefly flickered to Amanda, whose composed exterior was starting to crack under the weight of his scrutiny. "Dad," Michael said warmly, placing a firm hand on John's shoulder. "Sorry I'm late. Got held up with a meeting." He turned to Amanda, his tone shifting to one of polite curiosity. "Is there an issue here?" John shook his head slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Nothing I can't handle, son. Just a bit of a misunderstanding." Amanda, sensing an opportunity to regain control, stepped forward. "Chief Carter," she began, her voice faltering slightly as she realized who Michael was. "I didn't realize. Well, Your father was just sitting here for a while, and I wanted to ensure our space was being used appropriately. Michael's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened imperceptibly. He glanced at his father, who met his gaze with a look of quiet reassurance. Used appropriately? Michael repeated slowly, his voice even but carrying a distinct edge. Are you implying that my father wasn't welcome here? Amanda hesitated, visibly flustered. Oh no, not at all. I thought he might not. Might not what? Michael interrupted, his tone sharpening. Belong here? Be able to afford a coffee? What exactly were you thinking? The cafe had gone completely silent now, every pair of eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Amanda's face reddened and she stammered. I didn't mean anything by it, Chief. Michael held up a hand, cutting her off. Let me make something clear, he said, his voice firm but controlled. This man, this veteran, has given more to this country than most people can imagine. He's earned the right to sit wherever he damn well pleases. The weight of Michael's words hung heavy in the air. Amanda opened her mouth to respond but found she had nothing to say. Michael turned back to John, his tone softening. Dad, I'm sorry you had to deal with this. Let me get you another coffee. John waved him off with a chuckle. I'm fine, son. Just glad to see you. Michael turned back to Amanda, his tone now icy. I expect you'll treat all your customers with respect from now on. If I hear otherwise, we'll have another conversation. One that won't be so polite. Amanda nodded quickly, her confidence completely eroded. Yes, Chief. Of course. As Michael sat down across from John, the cafe slowly began to hum back to life. But the lesson Amanda had just received lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. The cafe resumed its usual rhythm, but a palpable change lingered in the air. Customers who had silently observed the exchange now glanced between John and Michael, their expressions a mix of admiration and reflection. Amanda retreated to the counter, her confidence shaken but her thoughts racing. Michael leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table. You handled that with more patience than I would have, Dad, he said, his voice tinged with both pride and frustration. John chuckled softly, stirring the last bit of his coffee. Son, life's too short to waste on anger. People like her, they don't bother me. But, he added with a knowing look, they should bother you. It's people in your position who can change things. Michael nodded, taking in his father's words. You're right. People like her need to understand the weight of their actions. It's not just about disrespecting you. It's about the example that sets for everyone watching. John glanced around the cafe. A young couple sitting at a nearby table quickly averted their eyes, embarrassed to have been caught staring. People make judgments, son. Always have, always will. The trick is teaching them to think before they act on them. Michael sighed, leaning back in his chair. It just gets to me, Dad. After everything you've done, everything you've sacrificed, to be treated like this, it's infuriating. John's expression softened. Michael, you can't fight every battle with anger. I've fought enough wars for a lifetime, and I've learned that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you live by. What matters is how you respond. At the counter, Amanda hesitated, clutching a tray of fresh pastries. The conversation between John and Michael had reached her ears, and guilt gnawed at her. She had made assumptions, acted out of prejudice, and now faced the harsh reality of her actions. Taking a deep breath, she approached their table cautiously. Mr. Carter, she began, her voice quieter than before. I want to apologize. I judged you unfairly, and I had no right to treat you the way I did. John looked up, his eyes kind but unreadable. He waited a moment before responding. Thank you, he said simply. Apologies are a start. What matters is what you do after them. Amanda nodded, her cheeks flushed with shame. I understand, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll do better. Michael studied her carefully, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he gave a short nod. That's all anyone can ask, he said. Just remember, your actions set the tone for everyone else here. Amanda walked away, her shoulders slightly hunched but her resolve firm. The incident had left a mark on her, one that she wouldn't soon forget. John smiled at his son, a mixture of pride and amusement in his eyes. See, Michael? Even people like her can learn a thing or two. Michael laughed softly, shaking his head. You're something else, Dad. As they finished their coffee and prepared to leave, the cafe seemed a little quieter, a little more thoughtful. For John, it was just another day. But for Amanda, Michael, and everyone who had witnessed the interaction, it was a moment they wouldn't forget. A powerful lesson in humility, respect, and the quiet strength of dignity. As John and Michael stepped out of the cafe, the brisk New York air greeted them. The noise of the city felt strangely muted after the tension inside. Michael fell into step beside his father, hands in his pockets, his thoughts still lingering on the incident. You know, Dad, Michael began, his voice low. I don't think I'll ever get used to seeing you treated like that. It's hard not to step in right away. John smiled faintly, adjusting the collar of his jacket as they walked. It's not about getting used to it, son. It's about understanding where it comes from. Ignorance is a lot easier to fix than malice. Michael nodded, though his expression remained serious. It's just people don't know who you are, what you've done. It's like they look at you and see a nobody. John stopped walking and turned to face his son, his piercing blue eyes softened by the weight of wisdom. They don't need to know my story, Michael. What matters is how they treat people, no matter who they are. Michael looked down, the words sinking in. He knew his father's story better than most. A young man who had volunteered for service in Vietnam, survived battles that haunted his dreams, and returned home to a country that had often treated its veterans with indifference or outright hostility. Despite it all, John had built a life of quiet dignity, raising Michael and his siblings with a steady hand and a kind heart. I just hate that you have to be the one to teach these lessons, Michael said finally. John chuckled, resuming their walk. Teaching lessons isn't a burden, son. It's a privilege. If one person walks away from that cafe thinking differently, then it was worth it. Meanwhile, back in the cafe, Amanda lingered near the window, watching John and Michael as they disappeared into the crowd. She felt a mix of shame and determination. Her initial prejudice had led her to treat John unfairly, but his calm response and Michael's firm words had left her reflecting deeply on her actions. She glanced at her staff, many of whom had been witnesses to the incident. Amanda knew she had a responsibility now, not just to change her own behavior, but to lead by example. Gathering her courage, she approached the baristas. Hey, everyone, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I need to say something. The staff paused, their curiosity piqued. Amanda took a deep breath. What happened today shouldn't have happened. I made a mistake, and I acted in a way that doesn't reflect the values we should stand for. We need to do better. I need to do better. The baristas exchanged glances, a few nodding in agreement. Amanda felt a flicker of hope. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but this was a start. Outside, Michael and John reached a corner where they were about to part ways. Michael looked at his father, a question in his eyes. You think she'll actually change? John smiled, his face lighting up with the quiet confidence that had carried him through life's challenges. I think she'll try. And sometimes, son, that's all it takes to make the world a little better. Michael nodded, pulling his father into a quick hug. Love you, Dad. Thanks for the reminder of what really matters. Love you too, son, John replied. Now get back to keeping this city safe. As they went their separate ways, each carried the weight of the day differently. For John, it was another chapter in a lifetime of lessons. For Michael, it was a reminder of the dignity his father carried and the responsibility to uphold those values. And for Amanda, it was the beginning of a change she hoped would ripple outward. Back at the cafe, Amanda couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. As the afternoon rush began to pick up, she found herself pausing between tasks, replaying John and Michael's words in her mind. Their quiet strength, especially John's, had struck a chord she couldn't ignore. Later that evening, as the cafe quieted down and the last few customers filtered out, Amanda called her staff together. They gathered near the counter, curious but slightly wary of her tone. Before we close up, I want to address what happened earlier, she began, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. I made a mistake today, a big one. I let my assumptions about someone dictate how I treated them, and it wasn't fair. More than that, it wasn't right. The staff exchanged glances, a few nodding subtly. Amanda continued, "We see all kinds of people walk through those doors every day. It's easy to make judgments, to think we know who belongs and who doesn't. But that's not our job. Our job is to treat everyone who comes in with respect, no matter what." Her words hung in the air for a moment before she added, "Starting tomorrow, I want us to do better. I want me to do better. If any of you see me slipping, I want you to call me out on it. And if you feel like you're struggling with this too, let's talk about it. We're a team, and we need to hold each other accountable." The staff nodded, a few murmurs of agreement rising from the group. Amanda felt a small sense of relief. While she couldn't undo her actions, she could try to ensure they wouldn't happen again. John sat in his modest apartment that evening, a steaming cup of tea in his hands. The small space was filled with mementos of a life well lived. Old photographs, medals from his military service, and books stacked neatly on shelves. He reclined in his favorite armchair, reflecting on the day. He wasn't angry about what had happened. If anything, he felt a quiet hope that his interaction with Amanda might lead to something meaningful. For John, every moment, good or bad, was an opportunity to teach and to learn. Michael, on the other hand, sat in his office at the precinct, still replaying the incident in his mind. He pulled out his phone and texted his father, "Thanks for the lesson today. You're always teaching me, even when you don't mean to." A few minutes later, John's reply came, short and heartfelt. "That's what dads are for. Proud of you, son." The next day, Amanda noticed a subtle but powerful change. Customers who had witnessed the scene the day before greeted her with unexpected warmth. A woman who had been sitting nearby during the confrontation approached Amanda as she ordered her coffee. "I saw what happened yesterday," the woman said softly, "and I heard your apology. It meant a lot. We don't often see people own up to their mistakes like that." Amanda nodded, a mix of humility and gratitude in her expression. "Thank you," she replied. "I'm just trying to make things right." The woman smiled. "It's a good start." For John, the incident at the cafe became just another chapter in his life story, a moment of quiet strength in the face of prejudice. For Amanda, it was a catalyst for growth, a reminder that leadership required humility and self-awareness. And for Michael, it reinforced the values his father had instilled in him from a young age: respect, dignity, and the power of standing up for what's right. The lesson spread beyond the cafe, touching the lives of everyone who had been there that day. And in the heart of New York City, amidst its chaos and complexity, a small but meaningful change had begun to take root. Weeks passed, and the cafe returned to its usual rhythm. Yet, something had undeniably changed. Amanda's apology had set a precedent not only for her staff, but for the regulars who frequented the place. The cafe, once known for its exclusivity, now had an air of openness that hadn't existed before. Amanda had made a conscious effort to lead by example. She started small, greeting every customer warmly, regardless of their appearance or demeanor. She encouraged her staff to do the same, holding regular team meetings to discuss the importance of respect and inclusivity. Over time, her team embraced the change, and the cafe began to feel less like a sterile boutique and more like a welcoming community space. One chilly afternoon, John decided to return to the cafe. It wasn't out of a sense of obligation or even curiosity. He simply wanted to enjoy another cup of their excellent coffee. Dressed in the same modest jacket and jeans, he stepped inside, scanning the room for a familiar face. Amanda spotted him immediately. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she froze. Then, steeling herself, she approached him with genuine warmth. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice steady but filled with sincerity. "It's good to see you again." John smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Well, I thought I'd give this place another try. Heard it's under new management," he teased lightly. Amanda chuckled, relieved by his good-natured response. "We're working on it," she said. "Let me get you a coffee." "It's on the house." John tilted his head, studying her for a moment. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "but I'd rather pay for it. That way, I'm just another customer like everyone else." Amanda nodded, understanding the quiet lesson in his words. Of course. I'll get that started for you. As she prepared his coffee, a few regulars greeted John with nods and smiles, having recognized him from his previous visit. One young man, who had been silent during the confrontation weeks earlier, approached him. "Sir," the man began, his voice hesitant, "I just wanted to say, I was here last time. I didn't speak up, and I should have. I've been thinking about it ever since. What you and your son said. It really stuck with me." John nodded, his expression kind. "It's never too late to start doing the right thing, son. The fact that you're thinking about it means you're already on the right path." The young man smiled, visibly moved. "Thank you." Word of the cafe's transformation began to spread. Local veterans groups started holding occasional meetings there, drawn by its newfound reputation for warmth and respect. The staff, once apprehensive about the changes Amanda had implemented, began to take pride in their work. The cafe became a symbol of what could happen when humility and accountability met a willingness to grow. John's story became something of a local legend. Customers would speak of the quiet man who had taught a valuable lesson without anger or malice. For Amanda, his return marked a milestone in her journey of redemption. When Michael heard about his father's return to the cafe, he wasn't surprised. "That's Dad for you," he told his team at the precinct with a chuckle. "Always teaching lessons, even when he's just trying to drink his coffee." But deep down, Michael felt a swelling pride. His father had once again shown him that true strength didn't come from authority or power. It came from the quiet conviction to stand by your principles and treat others with dignity, no matter the circumstances. What began as a moment of misunderstanding had blossomed into a story of redemption and growth. For John, Michael, Amanda, and everyone touched by the events that day, it was a reminder of the transformative power of respect and the ripple effects of a single moment of grace. The cafe became a staple in John's routine. Every Thursday afternoon, he'd walk in, order his coffee, and sit by the window. The staff knew him by name now, and Amanda made a point to personally greet him whenever she saw him. For John, it wasn't about the coffee. It was about the sense of community that had grown since his first visit. One day, as John sat jotting notes in his small, worn notebook, a young woman approached him. She looked to be in her early 20s, her demeanor nervous but determined. "Excuse me, Mr. Carter," she said softly. John looked up, his warm smile immediately putting her at ease. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" I just wanted to thank you," she began, twisting her hands nervously. "I was here the first time you came in, and I saw what happened. It made me think a lot about how I treat people, how quick I am to judge." John tilted his head, his gaze thoughtful. "That's a brave thing to admit," he said kindly. "What have you done about it?" The young woman hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I started volunteering at a local shelter, meeting people from all walks of life. It's changed me. And it started because of you." John's smile widened, a quiet pride shining in his eyes. "That's wonderful to hear. But remember, the real credit goes to you. You made the choice to do something different." The young woman nodded, her confidence growing. "Thank you, sir, for inspiring me." As she walked away, John returned to his notebook, jotting down a single word: kindness. Amanda had become a different leader since that day. She worked hard to shed her old habits and embrace a more open-minded approach, not only in the cafe but in her personal life. She began attending workshops on leadership and inclusion, sharing her journey with her staff and encouraging them to grow alongside her. One evening, as she locked up the cafe, she spotted a small envelope tucked under the door. Curious, she picked it up and opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. "Amanda, thank you for being brave enough to change. Your efforts have made this cafe more than a business. It's become a haven for many. JC." Amanda smiled, her eyes misting over. She tucked the note into her pocket, vowing to live up to John's words. Back at the precinct, Michael found himself referencing the cafe incident often. It became a teaching moment for his team, a reminder of how small actions could leave lasting impacts. He shared his father's wisdom during roll calls and community outreach programs, emphasizing the importance of respect and empathy in every interaction. One evening, after a particularly challenging day, Michael sat at his desk and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his photos, stopping at a recent picture of him and John, taken during a family gathering. Smiling, he sent his father a quick text. "Dad, you're my hero. Always have been." John's reply came moments later. "And you're mine. Proud of the man you've become." Over time, the cafe's story spread beyond its walls. A local journalist heard about the incident and wrote an article about John Carter, the humble veteran who had sparked a quiet revolution in a small corner of Manhattan. The piece resonated with readers, earning praise and sparking conversations about kindness and respect. Veterans and community leaders began to frequent the cafe, drawn by its welcoming atmosphere and the story of the man who had helped shape it. Amanda embraced the attention, not for personal gain, but to amplify the message. Change was possible, and it started with one choice at a time. For John, life went on as usual. He didn't see himself as a hero or a symbol, just a man trying to live with integrity. But the ripples of his actions touched lives in ways he would never fully understand. John Carter's story became a reminder that change doesn't require grand gestures or loud proclamations. Sometimes, it begins with a simple act of standing firm in one's values. In a world that often feels divided, John's quiet dignity reminded everyone who encountered him that respect and kindness could bridge even the widest gaps. And in a small cafe in Manhattan, his legacy endured, not as a story of conflict, but as a story of hope. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's incredibly moving.